What do you make of the current conversation around domestic violence and this kind of moment we find ourselves in? Someone was asking me recently on a talkback episode of this show how I feel about the exhortation that men need to do better, like that the answer to this is that men as a group need to do better. And so we were wrestling with the question of how do you bring along the largest number of men in the mission to try to clamp down on domestic violence and violence from males without being, quote-unquote, divisive.
This is a classic example. I think that men are under pressure. I think our men are struggling, and I think our men are in crisis, and I think we need to support men. I don't think we can talk about the violence figures, which incidentally are, now I just read them this morning and I wish I could remember them exactly, but we know that men are also victims of violence. So we know that men are perpetrating violence in Australia in high numbers. We know that women are victims of the violence, but the highest numbers of victims of the violence are the men. But I don't think we can look at the violence, the statistics of violence, without also looking at the statistics of suicide. And 6 men a day take their own lives in Australia. 6 men every single day in Australia take their own lives. That's a mental health crisis. And I think the violence levels are also a mental health crisis. So I'm not in any way coddling men, obviously. But I don't think that meeting violence with violence or with harshness has ever worked. I think we know that, right? We know that. Meeting violence, like, where is it coming from? What's the common denominator with a bloke who kills his wife, puts her in a wheelie bin by the highway and takes off back to India? What's he got in common with a young man who kills his mum in the suburbs of Melbourne? What's he got in common with a bloke in Ballarat who kills a lady he doesn't know while she's having a jog? Sorry about my dog.
That's right. It adds a little colour and entertainment and flair to an otherwise dark topic.
It adds a lot of domesticity, you know, because these are people. A woman a day was killed, a woman a week was killed in Australia. We're now down to a woman every 4 days. And I always think, you know, does next week's woman know she's in danger? Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do know they're in danger, and they try to tell people.
And that is the tragedy of domestic violence specifically, right? And the overwhelming majority of victims of domestic violence are women. But as you say, if you're talking about the problem of male violence, men are violent, especially young men are violent, and part of the triumph of civilization is to try to constrain those motivations that you see come out in all boys boarding schools and in civil wars and in other environments where young men don't have their violence contained. And more than twice as many men are killed by men than women. But they're not in domestic violence situations. So it's not by someone necessarily who they trust or who has power over them. It could be an act of
But
random
if we're talking
violence.
about preventing it, you know, many of these acts of domestic violence are performed by men who've not committed acts of domestic violence before. So if we're talking about preventing future acts of violence, this is what I'm saying. We need to look at the red flags. You know, there are many cases of men who murder their partners or former partners who've never physically assaulted them before, who've never hit them before.
Is that true?
Absolutely,
I mean, obviously
it's
true in some cases, but is that actually is that a significant proportion of people?
It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. This is why we've started looking so seriously at coercive control and of all the red flags, like, you know, strangulation, for example, was not considered to be, an attack, an act of violence.
Right, but obviously it is. I mean, we
say obviously, but you'd be shocked at the number of women who've never considered that to be an act of violence in their relationship. So you'd be amazed the number of women who say that they realised they were victims of domestic violence after some time. Who didn't realise that what was going on in their home was domestic violence, the pushing, the shoving, the elbowing, the having the hand around the neck during an argument. So this is what I'm saying. If you want to prevent, it's not enough to sort of look at people who are already having the cops called on them because of the level of violence in their homes. That's one aspect of prevention. But our men are in crisis, and we need to look at why. Why? How did we get here with Australian men? What's happening in our culture? Why? Yeah, why?
What's your hunch?
I think that the identity of Australian men has changed a lot in a really short period of time. I think that what is expected of men, what we're asking of them, what we're offering them has changed. I think there's a lot of fear. Certainly recently there's a lot of financial fear. There's a lot of what's going to happen to me. What is my future? Can I create a future? Can I, how am I going to build a future that looks in any way like my childhood? Can I create any kind of childhood for my children? I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of confusion about where they're heading.
On my ABC show, I used to interview Hunter Johnson, who has an outfit called the Man Cave, where he works with the mental health of adolescent boys and creates bonds between boys and their fathers. And he often cops a lot of flack from a certain cohort of the women's rights or feminist groups for why are you focusing on men and trying to empower toxic masculinity instead of focusing on the real, issue, which is that women are being murdered and beaten. And his attitude is until you find constructive visions of masculinity for young men, nothing else is going to work. And a lot of the kids he works with are kids who would otherwise go down an Andrew Tate, rabbit hole or something because they don't know who they're supposed to be. They know what they're not. They know what is bad about them, which is that they have this toxic masculinity, and that they're sort of paralyzed by confusion around consent in some ways and, how they are supposed to express the urges that they're feeling. And so they box it all up, and some cohort of them will go the Andrew Tate route and be like, fuck it, if, I'm sick of being told that there's something broken about me. If I'm toxic, let's embrace the toxicity.
Yeah.
So we need more Hunter Johnsons in the world to derail people off that.
Why wouldn't you? If someone's offering to empower you, this is why people join gangs, joining groups has always been inviting for people who feel alienated, whether it's a footy club, whether it's, a cult, any kind of group that offers you comfort, that offers you brotherhood, sisterhood, that makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself, that's welcoming, makes you feel strong and correct, like, you're a good person, is obviously attractive. And if somebody like Andrew Tate is going to tell you that you're okay and that everyone else is wrong and that it's all bullshit, because it feels a bit bullshitty at the moment. Everything feels a bit crazy, right? It's hard to make sense. It's hard for me to make sense of it. I'm a 50-year-old person.